Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Annastashia Teepe. Annastashia is an educational consultant with the Wyoming Department of Education. She came to WDE after practicing school psychology in Wyoming for 12 years. Prior to her work in Wyoming, Annastashia was a school psychologist in Nebraska, serving rural schools throughout the service unit system and participating as part of the Nebraska Early Development Network as an early childhood school psychologist. She holds a Master's of Science degree in general psychology with an emphasis in cognition and instruction, and an educational specialist degree in school psychologist. Please join me in welcoming Annastashia.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking your time to spend your morning with me in learning about or reviewing the topic of early childhood evaluation, and specifically how observations play a key role in our early evaluation practices. So as we go through this morning, I just want to briefly explain my agenda for today. And so, but before I do that, I better just explain a little bit about myself. Because I am on camera. And so the one thing you need to know about me is that I am unmedicated ADHD. So you're gonna note as you see me on camera that I move quite a bit and that I also speak pretty fast. So if at any time I get to speaking too quickly and things don't make sense, please just send a chat to Dina and she will go ahead and tell me to slow down. Or if it ever looks like I'm just getting too wild on camera, please also send a chat to Dina about that. And I will just try to regulate myself a little bit more. I am still getting used to this whole virtual life that we're living in. And it is pretty difficult for me to learn how to be on camera without people around me to help me kind of modulate that whole interaction. So please just help me out with that if you would. Because this is a different world we are living in right now. And so then the agenda for today, the first thing that I want us to do is just to review pretty briefly our child find expectations, just both federally with the IDEA and then also at the state level with Chapter 7, to give us kind of a foundation that we can all understand as we move forward, and then to move into the best practices in terms of evaluation processes and procedures, and specifically talking about collaborative problem solving, assessment planning, assessment tools that we could be using, and observations. The one thing that I do want to note is that we're not going to be delving into the specifics of assessment or evaluation for specific disability categories. That's really kind of for individual teams to be planning around. This is more that broader view of the system of evaluation or the framework of evaluation, and how there are best practices that can be determined for teams and schools and public agencies to put in terms of a framework that they can be using. The other thing that I want us to note as we are moving forward is that when I talk about assessment, I am typically using that term in terms of the tools that teams or agencies are using, not necessarily in terms of an evaluation process. And so just to kind of clarify that as we get going, I'm going to try to keep to that during this presentation. Typically, if I'm using the term assessment, I'm talking about the actual tools or strategies that a team would be using, not in terms of the entire evaluation process. So just as we kind of think about that in terms of a global context, that's kind of where we will be going today. And then we're going to wrap up just kind of with a specific time designated question and answer. But as Dina mentioned, I'm really open for some interaction from you all today. So please feel free to send your questions as we move forward. Okay. So to begin, with that foundation of our federal expectations with child find, we know that the federal government has expected that states define specific policies and procedures that tell us that any child who has a disability or a suspected disability should be identified, they should be located, and then we should be evaluating those children to determine if they have a disability. That is kind of this global expectation that the IDEA has for states to determine those policies and procedures. So in Wyoming then, what Chapter 7 has defined for us is that particular state policy and procedure. And the particular expectations is that school districts and public agencies define their own policies and procedures, that within those specific agencies or school districts, that in those locations, we also have a obligation to locate, identify, and evaluate children who, whether they are attending private schools, whether they are in particular facilities, whether they are highly mobile, so if they are moving in and out of those locations, even if they are demonstrating some advancement from grade to grade, if there is that suspicion of a disability, we are of course identifying those children using some particular policy or procedure. So that's kind of the foundation then that tells us we have an obligation to evaluate. Those two sort of mandates that have come down from the federal level to the state, and then the state onto the districts, have given us this expectation of evaluation. The other thing that it has done for us is given us some expectation of qualified personnel. And the reason that this is really important for us is because it has outlined for us a really critical component. And that is the component of the difference between Part B and Part C when it comes to how qualified personnel do business. And what I mean by that is that when we are working with infants and toddlers to evaluate or to complete our child find obligation, both the IDEA and because of our opportunities to define our child find obligations, we are allowed to use informed clinical opinion more freely when working in the realm of Part C. And so I provided for you there Wyoming's definition of informed clinical opinion as it relates to the federal regulations around informed clinical opinion. But specifically what the Wyoming Department of Health, as most recent as of February of 2019, defines informed clinical opinion as licensed individuals making determinations using qualitative and quantitative information in those areas that are kind of difficult to judge. And that's allowable both under federal law and a state statute. We're able to do that in Part C. We are able to use judgment in order to determine and meet our child find obligations. However, as we move into Part B and we are completing our child find obligations, qualified personnel are not as freely able to use that informed clinical opinion to meet our child find obligations. And that's really crucial for us to understand because we're still working with some difficult judgments, but we're still expected to meet child find. And the other really important piece of information here is that districts and schools and public agencies are also still responsible for ensuring that qualified personnel are carrying out best practices. And so as we move into the elements of best practices and we think about observations, we think about comprehensive evaluation, and we think about making sure we hit all of these components, we also have to recognize that this is that there is a crucial transition between the child find expectations of Part C, the child find expectations at Part B, and that the transition that occurs between the Part C and Part B transition hits most crucially at the initial Part B evaluation. And so I hope I'm making this clear, and I hope I'm making sense. But it just speaks to the really, really important job that Part B early childhood experts and early childhood practitioners have in ensuring high quality evaluations, because the initial early childhood evaluation is essentially the first, how do I want to say this? The first step into, or the first opportunity that a child has in ensuring that all of the components that are necessary for that child to demonstrate that he or she is in need of special education services according to Part B expectations are met. And so you have the legal, I shouldn't say legal, you have the expectations according to IDEA and Chapter 7 that a child has been evaluated by qualified professionals. You also have the expectations that a district has to meet in terms of demonstrating that that evaluation has met those compliant expectations. And those things meet right at this initial evaluation under Part B. So I'm using my hands a lot, and I hope you can see this, because, or visualize this, I should say, because when we move into this realm, what we are saying is that, or what we are setting up is an opportunity for us as these professionals to demonstrate the necessity that these children or the plans that we are creating for these children are high. Well, I'll quit belaboring this point, and I'll just say it this way. We want to ensure that the evaluation supports the high quality plan that we can create at this particular moment. So moving into that evaluation process and procedure, we can set ourselves up really, really well by explaining the evaluation processes and procedures, but we need to start with the components that come before. And so typically we are familiar with the referral or the screening process. So referrals that come from parents, maybe staff from a preschool, or staff from a daycare, maybe even pediatricians that have seen a preschooler or something of that nature. And so these individuals are suspecting a disability, and they are saying there's a need for early intervention that we are typically familiar with. In addition, we are typically familiar with a screening protocol that has suggested that a child is in need of more intensive intervention, and both of those typically result in an evaluation for special education. Those two components of a pre-evaluation or referral process we are familiar with. However, there is also more research that is now suggesting that a universal screening process, so moving into that multi-tiered system of support process, in which children are screened, they are benchmarked, and then they are provided intervention even in the preschool, is a way in which children can be provided services even in pre-K. It's still developing. There are not as many research-based interventions that go down into the level of pre-K, but the research continues to develop, and it is found to be a way in which that we can provide a referral for assessment for and evaluation for special education services. In addition, the other two components that really should be happening in this pre-evaluation process are those components such as collecting the relevant medical information, the health data, those developmental and specialty screenings. And this is really thinking about hearing, vision, if there is any suspicion of, family health factors that could be, impacting the child's development, making sure that those all filter into that referral process. And then also making sure that a qualified person speaks with and seeks that parent input. And the reason why the qualified person or personnel comes up again is because we are working in the realm of early childhood development. And so it becomes super crucial then that someone who is versed in that early child development seeks the parent input. And the reason that I speak to that is because I myself found myself having to complete one of these interviews, and I was working with someone who had very limited early childhood understanding and limited understanding of developmental, even taking developmental history. And so when you're speaking with someone or trying to complete that type of interview, and if they don't understand the child development, or if they're unable to take an effective developmental history, you may miss out on it or miss an opportunity to gather more effective information. And so my personal example is my daughter was born growth restricted. And so in utero, she did not meet growth milestones. And so on her chart, she's labeled as growth restricted. The social worker that I was working with saw that, and she marked her down as being born premature. Well, she was not born premature. She was actually, born past due, but that's now in her file as born premature. And so I think that's just a very clear example of someone who may not know the terminology, so someone who may not understand developmental milestones. If they don't have that knowledge, may end up misquoting or miscommunicating, and then you may have a situation in which you're not fully understanding or fully assessing what you need to be assessing for a child, or you may even be assessing in the wrong area. And so I think that's just the piece there about qualified personnel. We want to make sure that we are clearly gathering the information that we need to be gathering in a way that is most appropriate for the situation that we are seeking. And then we get down to the actual comprehensive evaluation. And the districts, public agencies, we have to consider this process from start to finish. We begin with that referral, we gather that information that is necessary to move forward. And we also have to think about, is there any existing relevant data that is going to help us complete this process? Have we completed all the appropriate screenings to determine if the information that we want to seek through an evaluation is going to be useful? Think about this in terms of, if we haven't completed a vision or a hearing screening, and then we seek to complete a battery of assessments. Well, if then we've completed those battery of assessments without a vision or a hearing screening, and it turns out that the child has a mild hearing loss, are those battery of is that battery of assessments valid or reliable? Those are really key questions to consider, because had we completed those hearing and vision assessments prior to completing the battery of language or cognition, then we would have been able to suggest a different course of action, knowing that vision and hearing screenings were completed, and we had determined that there was a mild hearing loss that is going to impact the results that we obtain through our standardized or other measures that we are using to assess language and cognition. That is the purpose of considering evaluation from start to finish, and developing an assessment plan that is global in context, that considers the whole child from a perspective, from that perspective that understands that all of these components are interact in some way or another. The other thing that we must do, and Bart a few weeks ago Dr. Lyman talked about this a few weeks ago, in terms of the necessity to include parents or guardians, because we also have to consider every aspect of suspected disability, and so parents are an extremely crucial partner in this process as well, because when we're working with our early childhood population, we are seeing a group of youngsters who have who spend time a little bit differently than our school-aged population. And so because they spend their time a little bit differently, parents are going to be offering us a unique perspective on what needs that child has. And so because that parents offer such a unique perspective, we want to make sure we take that perspective into account when we are considering what type of an assessment that that child may need, or what assessments we may want to be considering. And again, we want to make sure that assessments are completed, in a way that, according to IDEA, that are conducted by qualified personnel, that we have considered any sort of racial or cultural bias, that we are considering the student's native language or other mode of communication, and that we are really considering referral questions. And what I mean by that is, what are we seeking to answer when we set out to complete this evaluation? What is it that we are suspecting in terms of a disability. And so if we have those questions in mind, we move from that point, and then we consider what assessment tools are necessary to determine if there is indeed a disability in that suspected area. We understand who should be appropriately administering those assessments, what additional information is going to support whether or not the disability is in fact educationally relevant, or what tools will help us understand what is educationally impacted by the potential disability. And thinking about that in terms of when you walk into a classroom, an early childhood classroom, and if we suspect that a child may have autism, so we are going to be thinking about if a child is a child with autism or on the autism spectrum, then we need to be considering in a classroom that child's ability to communicate is going to be impacted. That child's ability to interact with his peers or with his teacher is going to be impacted. And so how can we effectively collect data to tell us whether or not that we are seeing that disability in his educational environment, and whether or not that is in fact a disability that meets Wyoming criteria. So that's how we need to kind of think about that in terms of referral questions. Or if you want to think of it another way, you could kind of pose referral questions as an opportunity to ask yourself, the child has been presented to us. Maybe it was a pediatrician who referred the child to you. And so you could say to yourself, that this child has been referred by the pediatrician with the suspected concern of a language impairment in the area of language. And so that is the question that we need to be asking ourselves. Does this child present with a language impairment? So then the questions become, do we have data that suggests that there is a language impairment? And if that language impairment is in fact impacting him in his educational environment, so in his classroom, then from there you could ask additional questions such as, how might that language impairment be impacting him? Excuse me, I have to take a drink of water. How might that language impairment be impacting him? So then you could start collecting some data for yourself, for your team, for your parents. Sorry, guys. Here we go. And the data that you collect is really dependent upon the environment that the child is participating in, the nature, or the nature of the suspected disability, the question and concern that is being brought to you. And I think that is, as we start moving forward from this point, the other important piece that we also want to think about is, this is why observations then become so crucial, and is really an element that is a very important part that we can start thinking about in terms of an additional data point that we can be collecting. Because observations then tell us another story about what is going on with this child. If you think about a student who may be, maybe the parents are suspecting their child, they just think the child may have some articulation errors, and so that is why they brought that child into to have a screening completed. They're hearing some speech errors, so that's why they brought the child in to have that screening completed. And so the screening's conducted, we've gotten that data, but in completing that observation, you may find some additional components in terms of how is that language impacting what that child experiences, how that child is able to communicate. There are critical components in terms of observations that really lend themselves to the educational impact that a disability has for a child. And so that's, I think, where we will get to. As we take ourselves into best practices, the one thing that we really have to understand is that comprehensive evaluation has to include multiple sources across all areas of functioning. If we think about this in terms of the evaluation eligibility criteria in Wyoming, oftentimes it is very, very easy to think solely about obtaining the scores that will allow us to determine eligibility in a particular category. However, we really need to take a step back, and we need to be mindful that the expectation from both from IDEA and from Chapter 7 is that our child find obligation is not to simply rule in or rule out an eligibility category. It is to determine what is a child's needs, what is their area of functioning across all all areas of and so think about this in terms of strengths and weaknesses. If we are suggesting that a child is a child with a disability and they are demonstrating a need for special education, for related services, and that they are meeting criteria as a student with a disability according to a specific category in Wyoming Chapter 7, we really are saying that yes, we've identified some strengths, but there are areas of weakness. And so I think if we go back to this idea, then we should be making those determinations based upon a variety of instruments. We should be making those determinations on a variety of procedures. And we should be saying that there are a pattern of strengths that we can use to inform instruction that will support these areas of weaknesses that we know are going to need the intensified instruction that we are suggesting is going to be needed according to the individual education plan that we are going to be developing. And so I think as Measles and Atkins and Burnett from 2000 point out, that whole idea of strengths and needs really should be a critical piece in what we are suggesting, that the multiple procedures and the multiple instruments is crucial so that we can establish both strengths and needs so that we can focus on taking the strengths to support the needs.
Hey, Anastasia, we do have a question.
Okay.
They say, what if the data collected shows that yes, they have a delay in language, but they are low in multiple other areas and seem to be DD? I know that we have been instructed to go with the language impairment, but there are times that that does not seem like the best fit for the child.
So this is a great question, and right now it's a I think it's a so I think it's a matter of I think it's a matter of understanding where we are as a state right now. At least as I understand it, and as I've read it, the developmental delay category does require us to rule out other eligibility categories, as you just indicated. And so my thinking has always been, in terms of the developmental delay criteria in the state of Wyoming, you would go with the speech language criteria, understanding that there are other concerns. You would provide for those concerns, and then especially if the speech language moves along, you would want to reevaluate before the change in eligibility would occur. Was that the only question, Dina?
Yes, at this time, that's
Okay.
the only question.
However, it leads us well into this idea of having a collaborative problem-solving model as we are completing assessment planning, and it really takes home the idea that when we are developing, whether we are developing an initial evaluation, whether we are reevaluating, or whether we are monitoring progress, and we have determined that a child's disability category is no longer appropriate. I think it is really, really crucial that all stakeholders, including family members, if you are that, if you are the related service provider who is noting that, this child has met their OT goal, and I'm thinking that we need to do some new evaluation. When we have a functional collaborative problem solving process, that is when we are able to effectively say, we've identified a need, and that need is for reevaluation, or at this time, these are the needs in these areas, and because there's an area of concern, we need to be conducting evaluation. And I believe the term is familiar in the state of Wyoming, that we're really talking about the whole child. We're whole child centered, rather than just looking at one particular area, because we know that we can evaluate and identify a child, in this area because they meet these this category criteria. When we look at that whole child approach and take those multiple perspectives from the team, it allows us to be a little bit more thoughtful with our assessment planning, or so we're picking those those tools more appropriately. And it allows for our evaluation practices to be more coordinated. You know, and when our evaluation is more coordinated, then our individual instruction and our IEPs become much more informed to meet the desired child outcomes. And I really think that that is ultimately the outcome that all of us desire, is to see that the IEP that we ultimately put in place gets us to where we want that child to go. And the more that we can get our families involved in this process, the more likely that we meet those outcomes overall.
Anastasia, we do have another in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
They said, I'm sorry, I missed the point that you were making earlier on informed clinical opinion or professional judgment. Can that be used when determining DD?
So, and this takes us back to there is a difference between Part B and Part C. So when you are working with Part C children, so infants and toddlers, informed clinical judgment as defined by Wyoming Chapter 8, it can be used. But once you have moved into Part B, so that would, that is our children who would be any child really age 3 and up. Informed clinical opinion no longer is a approved practice, because we move into Chapter 7 and then we move into IDEA Part B. And so informed clinical opinion moves out of Wyoming Chapter 7 and it moves out of IDEA Part B. Does that make sense, guys? If you want to give thumbs up to Dina, so I know that I've clarified that, that would be great.
They said, thank you.
Yep, okay. I know it's super confusing when you work in the realm of Part C and Part B, but it is a very, very important clarification for us to have, those of us that work in both of those realms in early childhood, because legally, and it really does come down to legally, once you've moved into Part B with these kiddos, it is not an approved practice, okay? So now thinking about assessments, and again, when I'm talking about assessments on this slide, I am specifically talking about the tools and procedures that we would be using to gather data when we are completing an evaluation. When we conduct assessments, schools, districts, public agencies, of course, we want to assess in all areas of specific disability. And we do not want to use a single measure, one assessment tool as the sole criterion for determining whether or not a child is a child with a disability. And that comes right out of CFR 34-300.304. So that is drawn specifically out of IDEA. We have to make sure that when we are making these determinations, we are considering multiple sources of information. So we are gathering functional data. We're considering developmental information, whether that be through a parent interview to collect a developmental history, or whether we are actually collecting data from a developmental measure. We also have to collect information in terms of academic-based information. And so that in early childhood may look a little bit different because we're working with a different set of kiddos in a different population, but we still at least want to gather information that is relevant for the population that we are considering. And so that may just be our observation in the classroom in which they are working. That is still academic-based information, but we still want to make sure that we are including it when we are making our decisions. And best practice would also tell us that we want to make sure that we have at least somehow considered the child's language, especially when we are considering if we are working with a child who may be an English language learner. We at least want to document how that has been considered in our evaluation process. And then we may not have a particular tool that is appropriate for an English language learner. And so oftentimes what we have to do is we have to assess using an assessment, for instance. When I was completing early childhood assessments, I worked frequently in Grand Island, Nebraska, and we had a Hispanic population at that time, and parents' primary language was Spanish, and so the children were going into daycare facilities where the primary language was English, and so these children were considered dual language. We didn't have any sort of instruments at that time that were dual language. We didn't have instruments that were Spanish normed, so we didn't really have instruments that we felt were appropriately normed for the population that we were working with. So we had to use what we had. We at that time we were using the Bailey's developmental measure, and so frequently what we were doing was denoting within our reports that the instrument was likely not given in the language that was most appropriate for the child, because the child was immersed both in a language or an English language at school, but was also immersed in a Spanish-speaking environment at home. And so those were the types of situations that we were trying to explain within our reports, that really there wasn't at that time a tool that was most appropriate for this population. Similarly, in Lexington, we had a Hmong population that we were working with. At that time, there wasn't even a strategy that would have assessed a Hmong population, unless we were using a nonverbal assessment. And the research at the time hadn't even been conducted about the reliability and validity of using nonverbal assessment to determine the developmental levels of children and if that was appropriate. So we were considering native language. We were aware of the native language, and then we were reflecting that within our reports, that we were completing the measures that we had that were most appropriate at the time for the students that we were working with, based upon what we knew to be their the immersion in their daycares, in the daycare facilities, and in their home environments, using translators when appropriate. And so those are the in terms of the assessment tools, when you're thinking about that, you reflect current research in terms of language and cultural awareness, cultural bias if appropriate, and then you also want to just think about, are these appropriate practices? Is this best practice, especially when you think about um, um, norm-based assessments, and if there is a assessment that is appropriate for those types of populations. Do we have minority populations? Can we access an assessment in that language? Can we deliver it in that native language? And if not, what is the most appropriate technique or strategy to use in order to assess those students? And then the other thing about assessments that we really have to consider is, again, thinking about our testing instruments, making sure, of course, that we know that they have reliability and validity to begin with, that we are administering them in a way that will maintain that reliability and validity, but also being aware of the difference between standardized assessments, norm referenced assessments, general outcome measurements or measures, and just kind of being familiar with all of those different types of tools, because each different type of tool is really going to point you to a different piece of data. And each of those different pieces of data is going to lead us to a little bit different piece of information, and it's going to be useful to you in a different piece of way. Right now, research really is pushing us toward general outcome measures. And the general outcome measures are those types of assessment tools that provide us one indicator of long-term performance or results over I shouldn't say over time, but they're an indicator of long-term development that really is going to result in an estimated change over time. And it gives us a way to measure if skill or if the skill is going to grow over time. So it allows us to frequently monitor the skill and change of that skill over time. And it is a important piece of data that we can collect, especially in education and developmental processes. These are now how things like the Battelle and the Baileys and our other developmental tools are now being categorized. They used to be kind of lumped in as standardized measures because they are standardized measures. And so they were frequently just considered norm referenced tests. But now they are being relabeled as general outcome measures because we can more frequently give them. And so it's just kind of we kind of need to change our understanding and an awareness of what our tools are with those changing times, so that we understand what we are doing with our tools, and that we are aware that in essence our tools are general outcome measures because they are allowing us to measure those developmental milestones over time to estimate and predict what might be happening, over time. Versus, those standardized norm reference tools like the WIPSI, for instance, which is, it compares a child's performance to that norm reference sample and gives us a IQ score based upon a theoretical perspective of intelligence based upon, a model that research now is saying is not necessarily as useful for us in early childhood as these general outcome measures, because crystallized intelligence may not be most appropriate in the early childhood field as general outcome measures, which are allowing us to measure growth over time. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that as we understand and look at all of the research that's coming out in the area of assessment and measurement, it really is crucial that we are aware of the assessment tools, and especially the research that's coming out in assessment and measurement, and just kind of keeping up with that, because there are some changes that come in and out of that field. The research isn't it's not within the last 10 years by any means, but it does change every now and then, and so just being aware of that is important as well. As is this next slide, which just talks about the test instrument qualifications, and these do at times do change. So we just want to make sure that we are aware of that each test manufacturer or publishing company and other governing bodies, like the standards for that come out of the American Educational Research Association, which is that standards for educational and psychological testing. Each of those entities do publish and update their own qualifications for the use and administration of particular assessment instruments. And so it, districts, schools, public entities, you just want to make sure that you are aware of those particular expectations, because they do change. And so, for instance, Pearson in just this last year did update their qualified user policy, and it is a little bit different than it had been in the past. And so Pearson, for instance, requires documentation of certification of in order to make purchases, to purchase and administer the instruments that it sells through its website. And they still do have a catalog that you can access, but it's typically just now through its website. But you actually have to submit your certification to Pearson, and they have particular qualifying levels in order to access various publications and tools and assessment measures. And the particular qualification levels did change just last year. And so, I just want to make you all aware that you may want to keep up on some of these standards and expectations, because they do change. And so you don't ever want to get yourself into a situation in which, as you're assessing a student, or you go to assess a student, and maybe you get to where that the manual has been updated, or the publication has been updated from the 3rd version to the 4th, and so you're needing to access it, and lo and behold, Pearson's changed its qualifications, and so now you don't now you have to submit your qualification, and you can't get the new updated assessment, because you're waiting to get your qualification from Pearson approved. It happens more frequently than you would expect, because it does take there is a lag time, and so I just would encourage you all to make yourself aware of those policies and procedures, and ensure that you have a conversation amongst your teams and your buildings or your agencies that you're aware of some of these policies and procedures, and especially keeping up to date if they do change, because those expectations, they're there to make sure that you keep yourself safe, in terms of, you would never want to get yourself into a situation in which you're administering something that you're not qualified to be administering, or especially if any of those rules or expectations have changed. And so now we're going to shift gears quite a bit, and we're going to really jump into this idea of observation, because observation is one of the tools that I think we sometimes as practitioners overlook as as a technique that we have in our back pockets that allows us to to collect quite a bit of information about children. And I hold it kind of I hold it near and dear to my heart because I enjoy getting into classrooms and I enjoy seeing kiddos. And so I could talk days and days and days about observations, but we're going to spend the last bit of time that we have here just delving into observation, because it is an additional source of data to document educational and functional performance. And we know that this data is needed to first and foremost establish educational need and the impact of a disability on educational performance. So this is that second prong of eligibility determination that we're talking about when we think about Wyoming's eligibility model. And but it also allows us to inform educational planning when we get into developing IEP goals and objectives. So that there's kind of two purposes that observations can serve. First, that whole idea of giving us information about the second prong of eligibility, but then also really giving us some solid information about what is it that a child needs in terms of planning for that IEP. So as we move into when we think about best practices, I kind of want to start from the perspective of that there are two main purposes that observations can serve. A well-conducted observation will allow an examiner to determine how a child functions in a particular environment. So we can gather informal data points for the functional levels of performance, absolutely. But we can also gather specific frequency and contextual information that we can then analyze to provide additional information regarding eligibility, regarding needs, and planning. But we have to then kind of think about how we are going to complete those observations depending upon those two different purposes. So if we think about those two purposes, direct observations can be used to support, to support the determination of social and academic learning patterns. We can kind of delve into what are the patterns that a child is demonstrating. We can determine or monitor progress, to monitor any type of change that a child may be demonstrating. And then we can also kind of think about what are the factors that we are seeing in terms of the relationship types of patterns. So if we think about this in terms of conducting an observation, we first have to define and describe the behavior that we are seeing within a classroom or within an environment, because from the perspective of a valid and reliable observation. If we're going in to conduct an observation, we want to conduct that observation in a way in which if I go into a classroom and I'm seeing a behavior, I want I want to describe that behavior in a way in which if I have another observer in the room across the way, they would be able to see the exact same thing that I'm seeing and say, oh yes, I know exactly what she's talking about that from talking about based upon the information that I have noted somehow. That's ensuring reliable and valid data from my observation. The other component that we need to think about in terms of observation is that we have to think about the number of observations that we need to be completing and the length of observations that we need to be completing. And typically we want to increase the number of observations because we know that a child's behavior is likely to change in response to all of the different stimuli that they experience in a classroom on any particular day, at any particular time. And so if you think about that, in terms of if, for instance, they are demonstrating a negative behavior, they may demonstrate that behavior because of the time of day. They may demonstrate that negative behavior because of the temperature in the room. They may demonstrate that behavior because of the smell in the room. They may demonstrate that negative behavior because of the task that they were asked to complete. So there are all of these different factors that could prompt the negative behavior that we have been asked to go in to observe. And in addition, we have to increase the length of the observation because we never know when those particular factors may occur. We don't know when that smell may arise. We don't know when that task may be asked of them. We don't know when any of those factors may occur within that student's day that prompt the negative behavior that is of concern. And so all of those components really play a role in the effectiveness of the observation that you complete. The other thing that you want to think about as you're conducting observations is that you have to think about how you are going to document all of this. You know, are we thinking about, you know, am I defining all of this in a way that's sequential? Am I defining all of this in a way that is taking into consideration all of these environmental factors that I've identified seem to be really important? So there was a foul smell in the room and that seemed to be really important, or it was just because the child was asked to complete a task, or they did really well in the morning and so it perhaps it's an afternoon, you know, it's tasks in the afternoon that seem to be more concerning. You know, how we document what we see becomes really, really crucial in making an observation effective or ineffective. And it doesn't have to come down to, you know, that we're making a functional behavioral analysis. It's just making sure that if I, as the first observer, am handing it off to a second observer, and they read through that observation, and then they go in and conduct their own observation, they're able to say, oh, that's not what I saw at all, or, oh, it's interesting, I'm seeing similar patterns. And that there are also tools for conducting observations. There are standardized record forms that you can purchase. Recently, this is the High Scopes Child Observation Record. It's currently in development for preschoolers. Right now, there's an infant and toddlers version that you can purchase, and it actually just walks you through particular behaviors that you demark. So that's for purchase. It's by High Scopes Publishing. You can also develop some of your own. Like, I'm going to hopefully. Are you able to see this? Did this pop up, Dina?
It did. And I have also, Tom had also pasted that into the chat for them if they would like to open it on their own as a handout.
Perfect. So this is just a observation tool that I've created. And so there's just simple behaviors that you could mark, and it's a 20 minute, 10 second interval observation form. So out would be out of seat, or talking, or playing, or making noise, or if there were other behaviors, or if they are on task, would be doing what they were expected to be doing. So this is just something that I threw together for this presentation. So that would be one tool that we could use. So I'm gonna try to get back to our, Dina, did it go back to the PowerPoint?
It did.
Yay, love it when technology works. Or you can also just, complete informal narrative notes when you're conducting an observation. So there are lots of ways in which we gather data from observations. There are oftentimes kind of reasons in which we would want to consider particular tools. And so, for instance, if we are wanting to gather information about a child who perhaps he has there are concerns that perhaps he he's ran off the playground, let's say. So there's been 2 instances he's ran off the playground, and that is the concern. So we don't have any indication that he has he's doing this frequently, so it's a low incident behavior. So that's something where a time on task frequency count isn't necessarily going to be appropriate, because we don't have any indication that this is occurring frequently. So then our method or tool for observation has to change to something that is like event recording, where we are going to, during playground time, we are going to take like a narrative account of what is occurring, because we don't have multiple frequent events, but we want to determine what occurred right before he ran off the playground, we want to delve into, were there loud noises? Was there a particular color of truck that ran by? Some of those things, so that we can understand what is going on that could have prompted him to run. On the other hand, let's say we have a child who is frequently calling out in his classroom, and it's happening multiple times within a 10-minute period. Well, that is something like where this little template that I just showed you would be a much more appropriate tool, because you could actually just track the number of times within those 10-second intervals that he has called out, and you could even compare it to a peer, so that you have a way in which you could note those particular frequency counts. Whoop. So now we are actually going to move into some practical applications and hands-on observations. I have 3 case studies that I'm going to present to you, and we're just going to move through these. And as we're, so kind of to frame this, as we're thinking about these and watching these little videos, I just want you to consider these 3 questions. I want you to think about, what are target behaviors that should be noted? What type of tool would best capture the behavior seen in the observation? And then, did the observation result in any particular data suggesting an area of suspected disability? So I just, I want you to feel free. You can use that time on task template that we have linked in the chat. You can offer kind of an informal narrative, or if you are familiar with a different tool or a particular type of tool, feel free to use those as well. And so we're just going to go through those 3 questions after each little case study, after each little vignette, and have some open discussion about what components of these observation snippets would suggest to us needs that the child had, additional assessments that might be useful. So during these observations, just kind of keep these 3 questions in mind. Any questions before we move into the first clip?
I'm not seeing any.
Alrighty. Here we go.
My favorite creamy one.
Frosted one? Okay.
Frosting, toasting. Toasting? What did I toss?
You are it?
Eggs, sure, please.
Thank you for explanation. I like the way I started eating her food. She's gonna grow up and be like Miss A, right, Sana?
Hey, what's fork? Could it pass the fork, please?
Sure. That was nice of you, DT.
Thanks, Bethlehem. Workout. I want juice.
You want juice? Oh, you're done? Juicy boy.
I don't want any more juice.
You don't want any more juice?
No.
That's fine. I love animals. We're gonna see the anaconda. Yes. Your favorite snake. And then lion, elephant, hippo, rhino, giraffe, zebra. What else? Yes. Bears.
But anaconda eat bears.
Yeah, bears. There's many kinds of bears.
The polar bear?
Yeah, He's so funny. Are you guys excited?
I forgot to get my dad is not giving me money.
I think your mom brought money for the zoo. Is it your first time you're going to
I
the
want to
zoo?
be the princess. I want to be. You need to be a
You
princess.
didn't like it.
It's awesome when you be a
didn't like
princess.
it.
You need to
I've been
be
there
a
before.
prince.
What?
Sana wants to be a princess, and I told her, if you want to be a princess, you need to marry a prince.
What? What? Who's Prince? Do you know his name?
Nah, I'm just
Any
joking.
prince?
I'm just joking
Could
to
be.
Sana.
Could be.
What did you
When she grows up,
She
she can marry a prince, and then she can become a princess. Like me.
When she be big, she will have a baby. Like my
Could
mom.
be.
My mom. Everybody, my mom married. Everybody.
Okay. So, after looking at that little clip, were there any target behaviors? Was there any impact that you saw in terms of her environment, in terms of her participation in her environment? Did you see any behaviors that impeded her learning? And then what type of tool do you think would most appropriately capture what you saw occurring in that little clip?
Anastasia, I'll just let people know feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to have a discussion. You can also post things in the chat, and if not, we'll turn it back over to Anastasia.
Any thoughts about this particular student?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Oh, hold
Okay.
on. There's one. It says the teacher was engaged with the student, so that helped the environment.
Okay.
There was a little bit of a lag on my end, so I'm not sure if everyone saw that. That might be part of why they're struggling to come up with something.
Okay. Well, let's move on let's look at Joseph. So this is Joseph. What letter did you find, Emiliano?
J for Joseph.
J for Joseph.
Like the Harry said.
Yeah. Oh, what did the big bad wolf say to the pig?
Little piggies.
Little piggies, let me
Come in.
And what did the pig say?
No.
Not by
My
the hair on my
chin.
chin. And what did the wolf do? He blew the house. Where did he go next?
The other house.
The other house made of?
Sticks.
Made of sticks. And what did the wolf say?
Little piggies.
Little piggies, let me come in. And what did the pig say?
No. No.
Not by the hair on my
Chin.
chin. Does that pig look scared?
No.
No, why is he not scared?
He's not can't blow it.
He couldn't blow it?
He fell down there. Ah, touch. Then, the end.
The end. Thank you. Can you go put it back on my chair? And so just the same question. Any discussion in terms of the target behaviors that you would be looking for, how you would document that particular target behavior, what type of environment you would want to, environmental factors you would want to document, and how you might want to communicate that there were particular behaviors that were impacting learning. Any discussion? And the one thing, I guess I will jump in, and then maybe this will get some of the conversation started. The one thing that I would want to note specifically about this particular observation is that Joseph really did require some scaffolding. And that is one thing that I saw pretty explicitly in this observation, is that Joseph was requiring some scaffolding provided by the teacher. And so that tells me pretty explicitly is that would be something that would need to be linked to any sort of instructional considerations that we would be talking about in terms of an IEP. We would want to be thinking about that as we were moving forward with an IEP. The teacher was definitely providing some scaffolding for him as he was reading his book there. And so whether we're thinking about accommodations, whether we're thinking about the type of instruction he would be requiring, Joseph was requiring some scaffolding and modeling and cueing. And so those things are going to be important for us as we consider the instructional plan we are developing for him moving forward. And so that would be one thing for sure in terms of environment and his functional performance that I would want to consider for sure.
Anastasia, we do have a couple of things in the chat.
Okay.
Wendy had agreed with you. She said the teacher allowed him to succeed by giving prompts and waiting. And Cammie had said, I felt like the focus for this child could be language development. The teacher provided him with guiding questions in order for him to answer the questions and to be successful with this particular activity. So it sounds like they were seeing the same things that you did.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, if we just compare the two videos so far, we definitely have some different types of learning occurring. In the first video, the teacher was doing some modeling for sure in terms of, appropriate language. But this type of modeling was definitely more individualized to Joseph's needs for sure.
Wendy also says that the pictures from the book provided more support as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, and now moving on to our final student, and just so you know, this young man is Draco, and he's one of my favorite kiddos. I just so you know, I love him. So I have a special place in my heart for Draco. So if I just think you will enjoy him a lot. So enjoy Draco as much as I do, please.
We have a high personality class. Great, but that way it helps us. Check it out what's still in there. Lorenzo, did your hands get washed? Here today. Oh, look at you! From the Black Panther. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll keep an eye on it. So, Draco. can help you after I put the milk away. You may be finished with that when I get back. No, it's almost. Is that what you said?
It looks like a lobster. Do you want to eat it?
7. I understand you want to try, but ask Drake
Where
what
do
since
those
he was
turtles
playing with
swim
it.
in Movie Nemo?
Do you want Draco to show you how he made it fit through the hole?
They drew a circle, and then they do like
Draco, can you show them how you make a whale fit through the hole?
Do they go to Australia?
So what did he have to do, Devin? What's too big? Oh, I think you made the hole even bigger though when it fixed it.
Are you getting
See if the whale fits through now, Draco. Go backwards.
Mommy, to where?
Oh, yeah, you didn't even have to turn them sideways.
Did you set them down, maybe? I don't know if Jesse realized that. Take your lobster. Why are we sad?
Mom,
Like a lobster?
Mom said she didn't think so.
Oh my gosh. The rhino
I told her
beetle.
we'd keep an eye on it. Go help clean up over it.
Does it go in the blocks or the spiders? Or the sweet teachers? Or the cute creatures? I think that's a lot.
So you're right.
One thing that I notice frequently when I view videos of Draco is that he often is needing support with transitioning from activity to activity. The one thing that catches me with this particular video is that he left his first stack of Lego to the house. He left it and went to another activity, and his teacher had to kind of redirect him back to putting that activity up. And you frequently see that with his all of his activities, is that he is still needing support, kind of transitioning and concluding one activity to another, even to the point you don't get to see it. They clipped it off in this particular segment, even to the point where he will get into conflict with his peers when he is not kind of brought to that conclusion by an adult. So that's just one thing that I would see, that I see frequently, and would probably want to just note.
Anastasia, Wendy has a couple of comments that she put in the chat. The first one says, the teacher engagement was only when he was having conflicts. He would have benefited from some modeling before the conflict arrives. And her second comment is, maybe using a visual schedule or timer to help him know how long he needed to remain at the activity.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Any other questions? Or comments? I think just as we kind of think about and pull together observations, I think that the main fact, or the main point that I want to drive home is that we can gather, even just in these clips with students that we don't necessarily know, we gathered a lot of information, just kind of as really secondary observers. We gathered quite a bit of information. Wendy's point about visual schedules and giving him an opportunity to know this is a structure that you could benefit from would really inform an evaluation and and you know, and whatever came from that an evaluation for Draco. And so that is the power of using observations, whether you do that through informal narrative, whether we would have done some frequency counts with Draco in terms of, you know, the number of times he left all of his activities or required teacher redirection in order to, you know, to get back to what they were asking him to do. That really is the usefulness of observations. And, you know, and when we think about the purpose of what we, you know, what are we setting out to do when we complete an observation, and has it answered the referral question that we have? There is quite a bit of power in observations when we think about it that way. And it all goes back to that collaborative problem solving and that assessment planning, and how are we fitting observation in, and what are we using it for? Okay. So really we've gotten now to, you know, where just kind of in summarizing all of this information, you know, comprehensive evaluations for early childhood, we just need to remember that they still need to be individualized to every single student. And I think we really want to start first by looking at the pre-evaluation data that we have. What additional evaluation, pre-evaluation data do we need to be gathering? You know, have we kind of gone through all of that information that's going to assure that the assessment data that we collect as we move forward is going to be valid and reliable. We always want to make sure it's multidisciplinary, that we're looking at multiple sources, that we're, you know, that qualified individuals from multiple perspectives are participating in this evaluation, and that we are also including those parents, because parents are providing a very unique perspective. And that we, again, we want to make sure we are addressing all suspected areas of concern. And then finally, that, you know, observations are a key component of data that can be used to answer many of those referral questions. And so finally, I'm just going to open it up at this time to any questions that you have. So if you want to unmute yourself to ask questions, or if you want to post questions in the chat box, we're just going to finish here with some time for question and answer. So
I don't see any questions at this time. Tom, if you'll go ahead and post the rest of those links in the chat, that would be great. We do have a link for the evaluation. We also have links for you regarding PTSB and STARS credits if you're interested in those. And as well as just, you're welcome to contact us at any time if you have further questions for Anastasia, and she can get back to you via email. Anastasia, at this time, I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. And we'd also like to just say how appreciative we are to all those who participated by learning, making comments, and asking questions today.